My name is Professor Nicola Graham-Kevan. I'm a Director of the Criminal Justice Partnership at the University of Central Lancashire, and today I'm going to be talking about men and trauma. So today we're going to talk about the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs. We're going to talk about gender and ACEs, ACEs and behaviour, ADHD and ACEs, and then we're going to talk about victims and perpetrators, from victims to offenders, and then the demonisation of men and boys. So I got interested in this area through my research on domestic abuse, and because of my publications I was asked to present at the European Parliament about the experiences of children who are subject to parental domestic abuse, so witnessing parents using violence towards each other. And it was really interesting, and something that became quickly apparent is that where there's exposure to domestic violence in childhood, where a child is having that experience, it's quite a good bet that they will also have had be experiencing other ACEs. So where you see parents having parents are involved in domestic abuse, the majority of children where that's the case will have at least one additional adverse childhood experience, ACE. That's 96% will. 74% of those children will have 2 or 3, and two-thirds will have 3 or more ACEs. And so what we find is as the number of ACEs increase, the problems increase. So really understanding that a child has been exposed to domestic abuse is like taking a canary into a cave. Once you see that's going on, then you can extrapolate there is high likelihood that that child has been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences. So that child is a traumatized victim. So when a child is subject to exposure to domestic abuse between their parents, what are the likely outcomes for that child? Well, there's been quite a lot of research and documents on this, and what we know is organisations have a specific way of interpreting the likely outcomes for children. So this is a professional bodies website, psychiatry bodies, so clinically influential and so forth. And when you look at on their page and you look at are there any long-term effects of being exposed to domestic violence, what we're told is, as adults, children who have witnessed violence and abuse are more likely to become involved in a violent and abusive relationship themselves in adulthood. Children tend to copy the behaviour of their parents. So boys learn from their fathers to be violent to women. Girls learn from their mothers that violence is to be expected and something you just have to put up with. And it's not only psychiatrists who have this view, it's also Women's Aid. So Women's Aid tell us the cycle of violence, otherwise known as the intergenerational theory, is often referred to when considering the effects of domestic abuse on children. However, research findings are inconsistent and there is no automatic cause and effect relationship. We believe the theory is disempowering and ineffective when working with children. A boy who has witnessed domestic abuse does not have to grow up to be an abuser, and a girl does not have to become a victim of domestic abuse later in life. So clearly there's a theme developing here. We'll have a look at one more. So here is UNICEF talking about the experience of witnessing domestic violence and how that plays out into adult relationships. And we're told the single best predictor of children becoming either perpetrators or victims of domestic violence later in life is whether or not they grow up in a home where various domestic violence. Studies from various countries support the findings that rates of abuse are higher among women whose husbands were abused as children or who saw their mothers being abused. So only women. It's only about women and their abuse. So women need to avoid men who have experienced violent parents growing up, and hence essentially women should avoid men who have had multiple adverse childhood experiences, because it's turned them into violent people. And it's not only websites, it's also roundtables of professionals are telling us exactly the same thing. Boys who witness their mother's abuse are more likely to batter their female partners as adults than boys raised in non-violent homes. For girls, this may result in the belief that threats and violence are the norm in relationships. So what we're getting here is a clear pattern of results of boys and girls being exposed to domestic violence growing up. What we are therefore led to believe is, if I as a professional know that a man who I'm working with has been exposed to domestic violence, then what I should be concerned about is not that he's actually been exposed to multiple ACEs and needs support and potentially trauma work, but instead I need to consider him a potentially violent partner. And for women, if they've been exposed to violence by their partners growing up, again, I shouldn't be necessarily looking for trauma work for that exposure. Instead, I should be seeking to, be concerned for this woman's safety, because she's more likely to pick a violent man. So essentially adopting a very learning theory point of view. So the idea here is that people replicate what they've seen in childhood, in adulthood, because it's learned behaviour. And the assumption here is most definitely that when we talk about exposure to domestic violence, what we are talking about is boys and girls witnessing their fathers or stepfathers abuse of their female caregiver, their mother or stepmother. That is clearly how this is being portrayed. This is what, in the minds of the websites, the roundtables, etc., that is what exposure to domestic violence looks like. And indeed, on many of the ACE questionnaires, particularly the older ones, but still ones used to this day, when they ask about exposure to domestic violence, they ask about, did you see your father hit your mother? And they never ask whether the person filling in the questionnaire saw their mother hit their father. Although all rigorous research suggests that male victims are at the very least 30% of all victims of domestic violence, but the really strong longitudinal meta-analyses type research all suggests that in the Western nations, men and women are equally likely to perpetrate domestic abuse. And indeed, the most troublesome relationships for children to grow up in are ones where both partners were using aggression to each other. So it is in no way an evidence-based perspective to even only speak about men's violence to women in terms of child witnesses. It is completely missing at least half of the experiences of children, and indeed it's probably at best 25% of the experiences of all types of witnessing violence between partners. So you've got 25% would be mums hitting dads where the dads are non-violent, 25% would be dads hitting mums where the mums are non-violent, and actually in about 50% of violent relationships we would expect to see both mum and dad hitting each other. Bi-directional violence, the most common type of violence in relationships. All of this is completely ignored, however, by the people authoring such cautions. So what do we know about the exposure to domestic abuse and adult use of domestic violence? Well, I looked at all review articles published up to about 2017, so up to 2018 actually, as you can see with the references there, prior to going to the European Parliament. And what these review articles, and they look at all the published research available, found was that exposure to your parents' domestic violence is a robust, cross-sectional and longitudinal risk factor for adult use of domestic violence in your own relationship. So cross-sectional could be asking adults, did you witness your parents using violence towards each other, or mum being hit or dad being hit? So you're asking an adult what happened in childhood, and then you're asking what's happening in your own relationship. A longitudinal study, which is far more robust, actually follows people from childhood, where there's violence, into adulthood to see what happens then. So more robust, but both of them find the same essential findings. This research shows that it definitely is a risk factor. So the odds of actually being involved in adult domestic violence is about 4.5 times increased if you witness violence between your parents. What's important is there is no significant difference if you saw your father hitting your mother or your mother hitting your father. Also, there is no significant difference in the relationship between witnessing domestic violence in childhood and becoming violent in adulthood to your partner. No significant difference whether it was a male child being exposed or a female child. There was no significant interaction between the perpetrator and child sex. So boys seeing dad hit mum were no more likely to hit a partner than boys seeing mum hit dad. And girls seeing dad hit mum were as likely to use violence as girls seeing mum hit dad. Parental exposure to domestic violence is a robust risk factor for adult victimisation for boys and girls. So these studies tell us you cannot say it's a simple relationship where boys see their dad battering, their words, their mum, and they do that. Girls, their mum's battered, and they repeat that cycle. This is simplistic and not evidence-based at all. So the point I would like to make here is exposure to parental domestic abuse is an adverse childhood experience. It is not a learning opportunity. And those who say it is and treat it in such a way do not understand what adverse childhood experience literature tells them. How we are to understand adverse childhood experiences is to understand that it is actually an exposure that creates, especially in critical sensitive developmental areas such as early childhood and other parts of childhood, particularly around adolescence as well. But throughout childhood, while neurodevelopment is happening, we know it changes how the brain responds. It impacts on electrical, chemical and cellular mass. It actually changes how the brain develops. The brain adapts to living in a stressful and dangerous world. And these adaptations are not seen in simplistic monkey see, monkey do type things. They are actually seen in a range of adverse outcomes, including psychiatric disorders, impaired cognitions or thoughts, poor performance in school and work, obesity, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, risky sexual behaviour, criminal behaviour, which we'll talk about, poverty, and as we've just spoken about, intergenerational transmission. So to understand it as a simplistic learning theory, you see something, you repeat it, but you think it's the right thing to do, to think it's normal and acceptable, is completely to misunderstand the whole literature. And there really is no excuse for that, because this adverse childhood experiences body of research is massive, it's influential, and to not include it is willful. Now, there was an excellent study conducted in Wales called the Welsh Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and what we found there was illuminating, both in what their results showed but also how the Welsh government chose to represent what they found. So we'll just have a dig into this table here, but we'll make it a little bit bigger. So this is the data table. So it's always best never reading the text without going and looking at the data. What the data says does not always match the text, and often things that people do not want to acknowledge are ignored, but they are required to put them in the data sections in the appendices because that's part of scientific reporting. So what I think is interesting here is you've got a whole range of variables across regarding ACEs, and you've also got this by age and deprivation percentile and so forth. But the bit I would like us to be interested in is the bit that I've highlighted in red, and here this is where we look at the difference for male and females. So if you have a look at under the household dysfunction, you'll see that exposure to domestic violence is actually higher for boys, 18 versus 14. So that suggests that boys are more likely to be exposed to domestic abuse. Girls are more likely to be exposed to childhood mental illness. Boys are more likely to be exposed to alcohol abuse and incarcerated parents. Parental separation, more likely to be reported by boys. Being verbally abused, more likely to be reported by boys. Being physically abused, more likely to be reported by boys. Sexual abuse is more likely to be reported by girls, and that is a consistent finding throughout childhood and adulthood, although estimates suggest that about 30% of sexual abuse victims are male. So a lot more than you would believe by what you would maybe see in the media. So essentially, it looks like boys and girls are exposed to a range of adverse childhood experiences, but if you had to say that one gender was more victimised, more vulnerable, then you would really probably have to say it was boys, not girls. And if you look at the ACE count, right, the far right, you will see that where you have 0 ACEs, there are more girls. So 57% versus 51. 57% of girls had no ACEs, and 52% of boys had no ACEs. So reasonably similar, but you know, some difference. Girls are more likely to have 1 ACE, but very little difference. Very similar across 1 and 2 ACEs. And this 4 or more is seen as a bit of a threshold. It's not an actual threshold, so there isn't a big step change from 4 to 5, but where someone's had 4 ACEs, there is quite a dramatic risk of poor outcomes in adulthood. And when you look there, you'll see that boys are much higher on the 4+ ACEs than girls, suggesting that we should be concerned for both boys and girls. But if one needed to prioritise the gender, and I really do not think you do, then you would be looking to prioritise boys, I would argue. So how did so what do we know about 4 ACEs or more? Well, so compared to people with no ACEs, those with 4 ACEs are 4 times more likely to be a high-risk drinker, 6 times more likely to have had or caused an unintended pregnancy, 6 times more likely to smoke cigarettes or e-cigarettes or tobacco, 6 times more likely to have had sex under the age of 16, 11 times more likely to have smoked cannabis, 14 times more likely to have been a victim of violence over the last 12 months, 15 times more likely to have committed violence against another person in the last 12 months, 16 times more likely to have used crack cocaine or heroin, and 20 times more likely to have been incarcerated at any point in their lifetime. So essentially, when we're thinking about a prison population, particularly, or any offender population, we have to now draw the conclusion that we are literally looking at the adult survivors of childhood adversity. So how did the authors of this report choose to summarise what we need to do in response to this data? Well, as you can see to the right, we are told that ACEs do not arise in isolation, but are associated with environments that tolerate inequalities, whilst life expectancy and high health outcomes are often poorer for men. Domestic abuse, sexual violence and other forms of gender-based discrimination. Domestic violence isn't gender-based discrimination. domestic violence is equally likely to be committed and perpetrated and victimised by men and women, and that is a robust finding since the first ever survey conducted in the early 70s. Where was I? And other forms of gender-based discrimination, so these are not gender-based discrimination, this is violence, criminal offences, are more likely to be experienced by women and girls. Blatantly untrue from their own data. So what they think we should do is tackle gender inequalities, and it's part of creating households free from ACEs. So we really need to be looking at the Violence Against Women Act, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act, Wales, which is a gendered act, and the 2015 provides another important policy framework in the prevention and protection against gender-based violence. So from absolutely nowhere is there any evidence of women being more targeted than boys, apart from in sexual violence, and even then the difference isn't so big that one could say this is a gender-based crime when you've got 30% of victims of sexual violence being men. And instead they completely ignore their own data, which is why you should never read the summaries only, and just start saying this is a gender-based problem, which is very difficult to understand unless you understand how society views men and women. And I believe we can see how society views men and women by looking at how society responds to men and women who have been likely victimised as children and subject to multiple types of adversity, and are now demonstrating trauma effects such as complex trauma and PTSD. How do we respond to these traumatised boys particularly? Well, we seem to happily diagnose boys at far greater levels with ADHD, which is interesting. But you've got to wonder, is ADHD actually the problem? Or is it that ADHD is what we're saying boys who are troublesome are actually, they have a disorder rather than they are maybe suffering from complex trauma through their higher than girls' exposure to adverse childhood experiences, because many of the symptoms of ADHD actually overlap very closely with trauma symptoms. So if you look at the overlap, and this is only, the very clear overlap, you could argue definitely that many of the ADHD symptoms actually very much are manifestations of a traumatized person. But you can see your trauma, your ADHD, your overlap, and many of those overlap items such as easily distracted, doesn't seem to listen, hyperactive, restless, can't sleep, can't concentrate. You can see how that would then lead to a difficulty in sustaining attention, struggling to follow instructions, difficulty in organisation, fidgeting and squirming, and so forth. And you can see how these trauma feelings such as fear, helplessness, uncertainty and vulnerability, increased arousal, edginess and agitation, avoidance of reminders of trauma, such as say if in that one, if you imagine if a teacher is annoyed at a child, you could see that that could be a very threatening thing if they've grown up with violent household where annoyance maybe is the precursor to extreme acts of violence which are traumatizing for the child. So many things within school could be triggers for a trauma reaction. Feelings of guilt and shame, disassociation, all of these things could easily play into how a child behaves in a classroom. So we've got much higher levels of boys being diagnosed with ADHD, and yet we also know that many of the things that we see in children with ADHD are likely to also be something you would see in a traumatised child. And maybe if that traumatised child was a middle class or upper class child, they would instead get trauma treatment rather than medicines and substances. And indeed, the research suggests that there is definitely reason to be concerned about a diagnosis of ADHD, rather than exploring whether a child is traumatised and needs a trauma-informed approach. So researchers said that there were 7 times higher odds of an ADD or ADHD among those who reported they had been abused even after controlling for potential mediating factors such as age, race, gender, and 3 other types of adverse childhood experiences, including parental divorce, parental addictions, and long-term parental unemployment. So abuse is a massive predictor of being diagnosed with ADHD. And what's interesting, when you look, there's a UK survey that looks at a survey of over 10,000 children aged between 5 and 15, and what they found was boys are more than 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. Individuals who are diagnosed with ADHD, so essentially boys, are higher risk of all 12 comorbid psychiatric disorders they investigated, compared with male individuals, which I thought was interesting. So comparing males with ADHD and females, what we found with the females were females showed a stronger association with autistic spectrum disorder, oppositional defiant conduct disorder, which is certainly probably trauma related as well, but intellectual disability, personality disorders, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, and suicidal behaviour. And they concluded this study indicates that female individuals diagnosed with ADHD are a more vulnerable group of patients. So what we're being told here is, like, when boys and girls are both looked at with ADHD, girls are vulnerable ADHD and boys are just ADHD. Now this plays out all across the whole spectrum of social care, prisons, criminal justice, this idea that girls are vulnerable and boys are not. But I actually am more persuaded by the second explanation, which is maybe the reason girls seem to have more comorbidity, so more additional problems to boys, is because boys are diagnosed at a lower threshold. So boys have to do less to be labelled a problem and have parents and teachers wanting them sedated to stop them being a problem to them. What is interesting is that boys are diagnosed at a lower threshold, particularly by female caregivers and female professionals. So it appears that women in boys' lives are the ones deciding that their behaviour is not normal, indeed this traumatised behaviour, or maybe even sometimes just generally boisterous boys' behaviour, is actually pathological and needs pharmaceutical treatment. And just because I know I'm making quite controversial statements here, and I am not an expert in ADHD at all, although I have said this in front of an expert in ADHD and they did not challenge this position, and I'm not saying that ADHD does not happen in the absence of trauma. I'm merely saying that we should be concerned that we may be misdiagnosing. And further evidence that this could be the case is that brain studies on ADHD and childhood trauma show massive overlaps in the types of in the brain areas and the development that you would see. So we know that ACEs have a problem with brain development. We've already spoken about that, but it's not a learning theory, it's actually a neurological problem. And what seems to be concerning regarding the potential overdiagnosis of ADHD is that actually even the neurological literature suggests that the overlap between adverse childhood experience exposure and trauma and ADHD is there even at the neurological level. And what is really concerning to me is that medication is the most widely used ADHD treatment. But the evidence base for pharmacological therapy for children with symptoms of traumatic stress remains limited. So if you are misdiagnosing a child as having ADHD, and when in fact they have traumatic stress, then you are actually giving a medication with no evidence base at all. And that's got to be a concern for parents, teachers and society generally. Which has led authors to say, regardless of whether ADHD is symptomology and child abuse or whether it is trauma, regardless of the relationship, but whether ADHD leads parents to abuse their children or abuse leads children to be diagnosed, or both, what is critical that clinicians should be aware of is the significant overlap means they must be cautious before they start implementing treatment given for ADHD, because, as they say here, it could be harmful if misdirected. So you could actually be harming boys by failing to diagnose their trauma symptoms and instead medicating for ADHD. So essentially, as a society, are we guilty of just medicating rather than helping boys? And if so, how does this look? How will this play out for boys? How will it play out for adults who have been misdiagnosed and mistreated, both by their parents, society, and the medical industry, psychologists, psychiatrists? So thinking now about adulthood, what we know about ACEs, how this can play out, is that as children get older and move into teenage and adult years, what you can often see is somebody who's quite anxious, maybe always prepared to fight or flee. They find it difficult to learn. They can appear edgy and hot-tempered, impulsive, hypervigilant. They can find it difficult building relationships, and they can engage in impulsive behaviour. All of these are commonly found in our substance users and our violent offenders, and really generally in our prison population. So one has got to wonder whether prison is merely the next step from the adverse childhood experience ridden home to the pupil referral unit to the doctor's surgery to be medicated and then spat out straight into prison when these young men particularly, but also girls too and women, become adults. If you look at research from the UK prison population, male prison population, you will see that the experience of adversity in childhood is extremely common. So most have had harsh discipline at home. They've grown up with criminal peer groups. There's been parental discord, which is shorthand for high conflict families, domestic abuse, criminal family members, adverse childhood experience there, family substance use, another adverse childhood experience. They've been in care, which is a massive traumatic experience, and obviously the result of exposure to severe trauma prior to being put in care. They have been emotionally neglected, bullied, abused and sexually assaulted. This is who now, from being a traumatised boy to being a troubled adolescent and sedated potentially on ADHD, and then into the prison system for them. So maybe we would hope that our prison system would, having known this research, there's prison government data on this, it's quite clear to those in power that these are a traumatised population. One would hope that there would be some compassion, at least for them, and recognising where they've been. And for female offenders, there is. And I am glad that female offenders are being treated humanely, where we see the need for them to have specialist support, where women have places where they can go, where they can feel safe and secure. And like inspectors are wanting to ease these restrictive COVID regimes for female prisoners, and we're concerned about their self-harm, and we're concerned that women have got nowhere to go when they're released, so these poor women have no settled home to go to. But we should have specialist support centres rather than prisons for women. That's literally a government document says women should not be sent to prison, they should be diverted into community programmes. And I honestly think that for most women in prison, they're probably correct, that prison is not an effective means of helping, and there are much better ways to do it. Unfortunately, although we know that boys are more likely to be subject to more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, we know the prisons are full of highly traumatised men. We don't have the same opinion of men as we do with women. So when we look at news articles about men, they're talking about sex attackers, transgender sex attackers attacking women. But where men have a more therapeutic regime, it isn't seen as a good thing like it was for the women's. It's seen as cushy. Oh, might as well put them in hotels. When men are going to be homeless when they leave, we're not worried about them having no settled home. We're worried that thousands of high-risk offenders are freed into homelessness. So, like you're releasing wild animals onto the public. And again here, nowhere to live, nearly 200 released sex offenders. So are we meant to feel sorry for them? I don't think so. I think we're meant to feel afraid because they're releasing high-risk offenders, they're releasing sex offenders from prison. So you get quite a clear idea that men, once you've had your trauma, once that's happened, then you'll be diagnosed as being pathologically in need of medication, and when you grow up and you go to prison, you'll be seen as essentially violent, dangerous animals. So this boils down to the use of words, and I think the use of words probably sums up the position of men and boys in today's society in the UK, and probably quite a lot of Europe as well. When we think of prisoners, and essentially probably when some people think of men anyway, you see this idea of men being risky, public needing protecting, but men are violent and sexual offenders, they're risky, they need monitoring and management, we need to protect the public from men. Whereas females in prison, they're vulnerable, and they are vulnerable. Do not get me wrong, I am in no way underplaying females' vulnerability, but what I'm saying is male vulnerability is exactly equal. What is galling is that women, when we talk about women offenders, we talk about complex needs, experienced abuse, trauma-informed service, abuse victims, these particular needs of female offenders, where there is no evidence, even by the MOG's own data, that men are not also complex, needing trauma-informed services, are victims of abuse and have their own particular needs. There is no reason for special pleading for women offenders when we should be talking about the need of the individual offender regardless of sex. But that is not the environment men and boys exist in. So when we look at the data on adverse childhood experiences and we see that little boy with his tiny little hands up, a vulnerable young child, when does he switch? When does he go from being that vulnerable little child with lots of aces? When does that change from being a vulnerable child to this? Men are dangerous. All men are dangerous. When you live in a society where these headlines, these sayings, these memes, these comments can be shared on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and everywhere else, and nobody's saying, oh, better not look at that, not safe for content. When we tell men how to sit, we say we're only as good as their bank accounts. When men have to write letters saying, dear women, not all guys are pervs and not all guys are absolute douches. Really? When men have to argue against being curfewed because feminists say that we need a man-free world. When we swear to God that boys should be locked up as it isn't safe with men with that much testosterone coursing through their blood to roam free. When we live in that society, it is no wonder that men cannot be recognised for the vulnerable victims that many of them are, and also the fact that men do not recognise their own victimisation is in no way surprising when all they are ever taught is to see themselves as an earner and to not talk about their own upset and sadness and victimisation experiences, but to just man up and shut up. So, to conclude, what we know about trauma and men and boys is that boys are more likely to have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and 4 or more adverse childhood experiences is seen as one of those really important thresholds where people need to understand that that person has had traumatic and distressing experiences and is likely to manifest behaviour which may seem problematic, but is actually likely to be symptomatic of distress. But what we see instead is that ACEs make men into perpetrators and women into victims. But ACEs lead to problematic behaviour if you're a man. But boys go from victim to perpetrator in the blink of an eye. They go from victims to offender just as quickly. And that will not change until society ceases to demonise men and boys and instead allows men and boys and women and girls to live equally in our society and be afforded the same concern and respect that every citizen of the UK deserves. Thank you. Now I put a couple of the picture I stole from a website which I thought was particularly striking. The slide 33 actually is from that website, and it's got some really good information around men and trauma. So any men who feel that they might want to seek some support, it's really interesting. And slide 34 also has a podcast where men are talking about their experiences of trauma and trauma therapy. So for anybody who feels they would need a bit of support or knows somebody who would, have a look at those websites. There's many, many more, but I just thought those two were really quite nice and very clear, and the evidence base for the treatments such as EMDR is very strong. So I would say it's worth having a look. Thank you very much. Goodbye.